So good morning again, everyone. My name is Janine Wright. I'm the K-16 Partnerships Coordinator for FEND. For those who aren't familiar with FEND, FEND stands for the Philadelphia Higher Education Network for Neighborhood Development. We have a webinar series focusing on topics of interest to the K-16 and college success communities. And this morning's session is part of that series. It's a really important conversation. And we have two really great guests to sort of talk about what they're doing in the restorative justice space. And I think you'll find it really interesting. I invite you to feel free to share what your organizations are doing, what your schools are doing. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to let them speak. You can put questions in the chat while they talk, or you can raise your hand at the end of the session, use the raise hand feature, and we'll make sure to call on you so that you can get your questions answered. We have this morning Mckayla Warwick, who is Executive Director of the organization Climb, and Kevin Bethel, who is the Chief Safety Officer for the School District of Philadelphia. So we're going to begin with Mckayla. I'll turn it over to you, and the floor is yours.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for what Janine is correct in calling an important conversation. Not saying that because I'm presenting, but just because I'm very passionate about this work. And you know what it opens up as possibilities for our organizations, for our city, and for ourselves personally. So I do have some slides, so I'm going to get started with presenting those. So I may miss some hand raises, but I'll be actively looking at the chat because I really want to make this as interactive as possible because I believe there's shared knowledge and learning to be had here. Okay. 1 second. All right. So if someone could gladly come off mute and let me know if they see the slides.
You're good.
All right. Cooking with hot sauce. So my name is Mckayla Warwick, and I am the executive director and one of the co-founders of an organization called Climb. And as you see on this introductory slide, we are an organization that is about restorative justice, but restoring our world so that we can build a future where Black joy, security, and freedom can be realized in our communities. So this presentation will talk about how we try to actualize that in our practices, but also provide some more general content around what restorative justice looks like and how it can be utilized in cases you're in as well. So I'm probably a new face to many of you, but I do see a few familiar names. Hi. So I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'll not repeat the co-founder part again. So I'll go to the next part. I am a 2020 graduate of UPenn. Don't know if there's any UPenn representation here, but I graduated from there with a major in sociology, minors in Africana studies and urban education. And truthfully, my classroom was the community. Anytime that I could be out of class and, walking the streets and meeting people, that's what I was doing. And so part of the reason I founded this work is because of the interactions that I had with students as they shared their life stories with me, and also putting that in tandem with my own lived experiences and the people who have inspired me. So I did want to include just a quick shout out to some of those students with that picture, and also to my lovely aunties who really taught me what restorative justice is, even when they didn't have the names of these concepts for themselves. So also to briefly talk about Climb is a nonprofit organization that works to empower youth of color through restorative justice. And the ways that we do that, you can kind of see this collage here where we're focused on how to build community between youth and elders, or building communities between neighbors or different neighborhoods. It's also about reclaiming different stories that people have been told, these false narratives. And as one of the lovely facilitators of Climb says, defying the lie. We also focus on what does the future look like? What are we building towards? And what are we healing from? And we have multiple programs that actually get this through. So we have something called the Restorative Community Project, which is actually a paid program for youth to become equipped with the tools to be restorative practitioners. And I have a quick plug on that at the end because we're actively recruiting. And we also have a youth advisory board, so youth shape the future direction of collective climb. And we also work in partnership with schools and also the district attorney's office, so that when young people are arrested, instead of that going through the traditional juvenile justice system, instead it can be referred to our program where we actively work with them to take accountability in a community-based setting that rejects punitivity. So I said a lot. So if you have questions, write those in the chat. But I do want to start with an opening ceremony. For us, an opening ceremony is a foundational part of a restorative space because it allows each of us to enter the space by sharing how we're arriving, the things that we're carrying, so that we can have a genuine, connected conversation. So I'm going to ask, what do you hope to find in this space today? And by this space, it's not just my presentation, but the entirety of this time that we have together. So feel free to write in the chat. I'm going to look and see what comments are saying, but I have put up the ones that I hope to bring. I hope that we'll find openness together. I hope that we'll share some wisdom amongst each other. I hope it'll feel warm. And I also hope that we can maybe start strategizing during the Q&A about how we can implement these things in our own spaces and also how we can collaborate to get through. So I'll just give a minute for that. Wisdom to restore my students who experience biases on campus. That's great. Hope in these difficult times. I'll save questions for Q&A part, but note taken. A couple more seconds. Wisdom and tools to better myself, community and youth. Updating on the practices that can work to pass them on.
Same as you.
Great. Okay, keep those coming. So I'm going to move us along just for that, but this question didn't end just because I changed the slide. So feel free to just continue to think about that. And so you can connect with the people who are saying the similar things that you're interested in as well. All right, so I'm going to start by talking about what restorative justice is not, because it is a term that is quite commonly stated. It has been in the public vernacular for probably over 20, 25 years now, but it's often put in very specific settings. And so people might not realize that restorative justice opportunities are everywhere around us. So I want to say that restorative justice is not only a justice system-led process. In fact, it is often done best when it is not a justice system-led process, but we often think of it as something that can only happen in the context of the juvenile justice system or the criminal legal system, when often restorative justice takes place far before arrests or police interaction are made. Another thing is restorative justice is not a way to recapitulate punishment. So just because, we're in a circle and we're talking through like healing and harm, that doesn't mean that people won't try to bring in the existing mindsets around punishment to that space. And so it is important to do deeper work to ensure that just because we're creating a structure, we are also doing the deeper work of reflecting and unpacking our existing beliefs. The next thing is I often hear this from people who don't necessarily trust the restorative approach, but they might say, it's too soft. It's too much evading responsibility. People don't have to really take accountability because they're just talking and because there is a lack of punishment. Well, I'll talk a little bit later about the power of that talking and how really in having to reflect and think through your actions is a deeper mark, a deeper way to take accountability. And then the last thing that restorative justice is not is solely about conflict management or addressing harm. Restorative justice is something that is about communities and can create healing and community relationship building. So let's go on to that as a transition for what restorative justice actually is. And if anybody wants to add in the chat, just in case this isn't fully comprehensive of everything you want to elevate in this space, please do. Again, wisdom sharing is always appreciated. So here I've created a chart. And this chart is not a scientific chart, but more so a visual one to show the ways that all of these different pieces are connected. Often when we think about restorative justice, we'll say, okay, a person has a conflict and another person has a conflict. One caused the harm, the other was harmed. Boom, let's do something to the person that caused the harm. Instead, this is a way to say, okay, in between two people are first the people that they love that are also connected to the incident or connected to whatever it is that might have happened. But we also have institutions that are in communities that can be there to support, or these are institutions where people spend their time, where people work, where people see these institutions as a deeply connected part to who they are. We also have historical legacies in place. So when we're talking about, healing in Philadelphia or addressing harm in Philadelphia, we have a deeper level of, okay, before Philadelphia, what was here? So that's, calling into play, like restorative justice is traditionally an indigenous practice. And it's something that we're trying to bring to the modern context and figuring out how to utilize it in that way. But we still have to acknowledge that there's going to be some disconnects and some challenges because of erasure and things of that nature. We also have culture and values that people bring into play. If we have a dominant value that people do something wrong and then they deserve to get punished, this is a thing that's going to sneak in both how we choose to act and how we choose to think. So all of these different pieces need to be addressed when we think about restorative justice. We're not just fixing people. In fact, we're doing quite the opposite. Instead, we're trying to do a deeper process of building connections and repairing fissures. All right, so I wanted to provide and pause with a quick example of what all of that looks like in practice. So I'm going to try to see if people raise their hand or throw up a random emoji, but who's ever seen a healing circle in practice? Other words that people have used instead of healing circles is healing and harm. I've heard a lot of victim and offender conferences. I choose not to use that language, but who's ever seen this in practice, participated in one, or at least knows what it is?
We have a few hands going up and we have a few emojis, thumbs up emojis and other emojis in the gallery here.
Love the emojis, appreciate it. Okay, awesome. So we have a mix going on. And so this may be a repeat of information for some, but a glimpse into something new for others. So just to speak about the work that I do with Collective Climb, the diversion program that we have with the district attorney's office is really the creation of healing and harm circles. So when young people are arrested for what would have been charged as a felony level offense, let's just use auto theft as an example, since we've been dealing with that frequently. One way of dealing with it is we first just meet with the young person and we get an opportunity to talk to them and actually listen to their different stories. So we get to ask them, okay, what was it that happened? And often the stories that they get to share with us are, well, I was hanging out with a friend and he came, like someone pulled up with the car and said, do you want to take a ride? Or I'm standing on the bus stop and I'm cold and here's a warm car. Or even I'm dealing with a lot emotionally. I saw a running car and I wanted to escape. So while all of these things don't take away from the consequence or the harm that that action called to someone else, when you think about adolescent brain development, when you think about the emotions that people are carrying, these are very human ways of acting. And so often we punish humanity instead of trying to address and think through, okay, how could we problematize this to figure out if you were met with this same condition before? And again, what could you do differently? Or how could you stop yourself before you got to that point to really unpack the ways that you're feeling so that it doesn't go, 0 to 10 like that? So other questions that we ask in these spaces are, what effect has this incident had on you? And we'll hear stories about young people and being in a cell, being arrested for 15 hours. We'll hear stories about how parents are not able to go to work because they're having to deal with court proceedings. And you'll also hear, when we talk to the person who was directly harmed by this, the ways that this disrupted their own life. And so once again, we're centering the person. And then when we respond to say, how can we make this better? It's about meeting those different needs that came up, either prior to the incident that were already there, or incidents that came up after, needs that came up after. And so it's not just, okay, we're going to punish this person. Instead, it's this young person will be a part of this process of rectifying the harm that they caused so that your healing and needs can be met. Vice versa, we'll connect with that young person and their families, and we'll figure out, okay, this happened because you were already at a 10. You said you needed to escape. Well, what programs can we find for you? What job opportunities can we find for you? Do you need a day of rest? You need a day of play? Do you need someone to continuously talk to, and connecting them to those vital resources? So that's a core shift in how restorative justice differs from traditional ways of saying bad, punish. Instead, it's let's take our time with this. Let's unpack this. Let's fill gaps. So another part is that specific example was more individualized or contextualized into a specific moment in time. Instead, I want us to also kind of think about how restorative justice is an entire process. And it's something that we have to continuously practice in order to make larger scale shifts. And I'm really looking forward to Chief Bethel's presentation after this to kind of talk about how restorative practices can work in an additive way to make substantive change. But what I wanted to highlight is what restorative justice can do when we think of it as a practice, as something we continuously must tend to. So looking at step 1 here, the thing is, in order to get started with restorative justice or restorative practices, we really have to unpack our existing belief systems. So we have to, and I've said this a couple of times, we have to ask ourselves the question, why is it that when someone does something harmful, our first inclination is to figure out how we can harm them back? Why do we feel an eye for an eye is the best case scenario? And I just want to think about, like, in the context of our city right now, a lot of the harm we see is coming from this continuous process of, you got me, I got to get you back. Now this one person can't get them back. So now my cousin has to step in and get them back. And we continuously are dealing with this process of, you can't be the last person to have caused the harm. We have to keep it going. So if we were to think through and say, is that really the best way? If we see it in the community and we can acknowledge that, okay, the levels of violence happening in the city is not okay. Well, can we also look at the justice system and say that eye for an eye approach also might not be okay there as well? And again, these are my personal thoughts. This is the thoughts of Collective Climb. So I look forward to a conversation if anybody wants to push back or wants to interrogate these concepts deeper during the Q&A. But moving on to number 2, once you do that work of unpacking and figuring out, okay, I actually don't think this is the best way, it's about learning then what's a different approach that we can take. And so restorative justice is one approach, this idea of intending to community need, meeting those needs, checking in with people, building connectedness so that there aren't these different gaps. But there are other tools in the toolkits as well. Then the third piece is, once we are collectively building a culture about harm and punishment and restoring communities as the real approach to tending to that, then we can start to think about uprooting those larger punitive systems. If we're on one accord, or if we're shifting towards a different mindset, what is it in the larger systemic, like what larger systemic processes don't work for us anymore in where we are as a society? And how can we actively work together to rebuild that? And then that's the final point right there. So if we're, to me, restorative justice and transformative justice are connected just like this. This idea of we're restoring ourselves, we're restoring our communities, we're restoring our mindsets so that we can start to build for what we want to see next. So it doesn't, like I was saying, it's not an end state, but it's a process to get us toward the future we really want to see. And so I wanted to talk briefly about how Collective Climb tries to contribute to this in our work. And just to clarify and be transparent, we're one small community-based organization. We have to work with partners. We have to work with schools. We have to work with our neighbors so that we can build this out to be bigger. So what I'm going to say is like one specific example. I'm not saying we're the only ones doing it right. In fact, there are many people doing it right. And so I want us to be able to elevate that as well and learn from those that we think are valuable things that we want to try out. So for us, this continuum, and I'll just go briefly right back to it, manifests itself through the work that we do to disrupt the traditional juvenile justice process. Once youth are in our program, they don't have to step back into court. They don't have to talk to any more police officers. They're truly in a community-based process. And once the case ends, we close the case with once our process ends, we close the case with the district attorney's office. And if they continue to work through and continue to work with us, their record can be up for expungement after that as well. So what this is doing is truly rejecting the notion of disposability. We're talking about young people who, again, are in their own moments in time, dealing with all of these different emotions, impacted by so many systems simultaneously, carrying so much. And to freeze their lives at something that they did at 16 is what we work to disrupt. And instead we say, you get to have the future that you want to have. So then the next piece is we're really big on transferring power directly to youth as well. I mentioned we have a restorative community project where we're equipping young people with the tools to facilitate those healing circles that I mentioned earlier, and facilitate community events. But we're also giving them the space to say, what do you want to add to the legacy of restorative justice? What do you want to add to the legacy of Philadelphia as a whole? And so we create spaces for them to host events on healing from the things that we're holding and carrying. We're creating spaces for them to contribute to different activist movements. And we're helping them say, you know what, there are people and schools and communities and churches and things like that that are part of my life that I want to know how I can shape to be in more alignment with this. And then the last piece is, it's kind of connected to that, but we're really big on working with young people directly in the community and using our community knowledge that already exists as our space for moving forward. So the same way that I give tribute to my aunts for literally showing me what a circle was when they didn't call it a circle, they just called it this cousin and that cousin are beefing and they need to be in my living room at 6 o'clock and I cooked something. Like we really want to elevate that as well, because that's where work is, a lot of this critical work is occurring. So I wanted to pause and reflect, just in the same way that I was saying, you know, we're not the only ones doing work, and there are differing scales of this. I wanted us to think about where we're coming from and how is this work of disrupting inequitable systems or practices showing up in the work that we're doing presently? And if it's not, how could it? How would you like to see that happen? So I'll pause for about a minute. You can start to write things in the chat. You can write this question down to think about later. but just want us to sit with this. So, all right, so this is a question I can copy into the chat after I'm finished as well, if people want to continue to think through it. But I'll just keep us moving along for the pace. But there is something I wanted to say. I feel like I've dumped a lot of content, but nothing is expected to be learned on the first time that you hear it, or even the fifth, sixth time. Like I mentioned, this is a process. Trying to be restorative in the spaces that we occupy or the roles that we hold first has to start with us learning how to be restorative with ourselves, us having to be restorative in the relationships that we hold dear to ourselves. And so this is just something I'm going to read, just read it verbatim. But just as we reject the disposability of others, we must do the same for ourselves. We're not broken. Systems may be, but we are composed of many fibers that are constantly twisting, tearing, and mending all the same. To rebuild takes time. Time requires patience. And so I call myself a restorative practitioner. I believe deeply in this work, but I can think to a time last week where I had to reflect and go, that was not that restorative of me. And so I have to do that process of forgiving myself and then being able to reach out directly and say, you know what? I want to make peace with this. I want to tend to the harm that I caused you in that particular moment when I said that in that tone. And so just wanted to call that out into play. So I am going to close us out, but I just want us, I have a lot of reflection questions because to be quite honest, the restorative process for us is asking questions and letting people process and then giving their response, because it allows them to actually sit with it more than if I'm just constantly feeding you what I think you should know or what I think you should say. And so think through the questions that still remain for you. And when we get to Q&A at the end of this, feel free to fire them off. Think through what doesn't seem possible in this particular moment as we think about what restorative justice is. Like, what is it that you're like, I cannot see this coming to fruition. I cannot see this existing in the work that I do. And we can elevate that as well. How are you using these restorative practices in your day-to-day life? And then ultimately, like, sometimes it's harder to think through, how do I make a space restorative? But it is easier to think through, what is it that I want for the youth that I work with? What is it that I want for my community? And start there. Start with what you want to see, and then we can figure out a process together. So with that, I'm just going to do my 2 quick plugs, and then I'll close out from here. So I mentioned that we are actually doing a program for 14 to 19-year-olds in Philadelphia. It's a paid program. We start with a weekend retreat, and it actually starts November 11th. And then we have weekly sessions on Monday from 3:30 to 6. And ultimately, it's a $450 stipend that young people get to participate. And this is the one where they get trained in restorative practices. So if you know a young person that you like to refer, please feel free to either take a picture of this QR code, and in a second, I'll also just post the flyer itself in the chat. But I want us to get started. I want us to do this work together. And if there are people that you want to refer, please feel free. And then on the last slide is if you want to stay connected with me and just, we can talk, we can grab coffee, or we can figure out how to work together more substantively, feel free to also copy this information here. So with that being said, I thank you all so much for your time, and I hope there were some things that you were able to glean from this conversation.
Thank you so much, Mckayla. Absolutely. And I encourage everyone to look in the chat because there are a number of really insightful comments and some good suggestions and a couple of questions, which I did grab. So I will be able to get those out when we do the Q&A section. So thanks everybody for participating in the chat. And thank you, Mckayla, for your presentation. And now we're going to turn it over to Kevin Bethel. So Chief Bethel, the floor is yours. And let's see. Okay. Slides are good.
Sorry. You know, I'm not as good as Miss Warwick, you know, with this stuff. And so we try this again. How about now? You got me?
Perfect.
Okay. All right. Well, again, every morning when we came in early this morning and we were going through slides, and I said, well, first I saw these powerful slides by Miss Warwick, and then I said, then the dynamic personality that goes with it in the presentation. So I will try to keep up with her energy and all the work she's doing. I could be more proud of what she's doing in the community. I grew up in West Philadelphia, born and raised in that area. So appreciate all the work she's doing. But she raised some couple of things that before I start my presentation that really stuck with me because, you know, my work, you know, I don't come to this space as an expert. I come to this space as someone who is running a system who wanted to see something change and see something different and do something different way. I didn't even name it at the time. I didn't know I was doing restorative practice. I just knew it was what I was doing was wrong, and I had something to do with it, make it right. You know, and I still sometimes sit in that space because when I look at Ms. Warwick's presentation, I'm like, as many times I see the presentations, I still feel like I'm not there yet. And so I have a long way to go. And it's folks like that who bring that. She said it's too soft, and people say it is too soft. I was in policing for 30 years. I ran the Philadelphia Police Department in my former position as a deputy commissioner, and I ran operations. So I ran all of the patrol districts in the city of Philadelphia. I've never worked more harder than trying to keep kids out of the system or to do things different. So anybody that thinks it's too soft, it's a lot of work. It's hard work trying to convince a system that it's historically has done it one way. People hate the way things are, but they hate change. And that would be a slogan that someone very close to me would do that. And so part of my work was just really how do we slow it down? And I think, you know, Ms. Warwick talked about how you come to this space as a, you know, where you come from. I'm a kid who grew up in the city of Philadelphia. My mother raised 4 boys by herself. My father left us when we were young children, and very, very, very young children. And the challenge for me in that time was, you know, what was I going to do and how was I going to do? I didn't know those restorative practices were actually on the way, like Ms. Warwick talked about, folks who were around me to help me do that. But I also came out of that space saying, I got pulled up by the bootstraps. If I got out the community, why can't you? You know, and that hardened approach to saying, if I could get out as a mother who raised 4 boys and come out some of the most violent area of the city, then how come everybody else can't come behind me? What I didn't realize is I didn't have that kind of trauma as I would become better educated in this space. I didn't come from the trauma that some of our kids come today. Though I was poor, I ate, you know, and I had fellowship and I had love and I had folks around me who could take me to another place. And so I just want to really re-emphasize, it's not an infomercial for Ms. Warwick, but it takes hard work to go out and, you know, it's a world that many of you see, and then there's another world. And that world that she's working in now really needs as much support as possible. So I'll stop there and kind of move into, you know, what does it look like, you know, for us as an agency? You know, in 2014, I would leave the Philadelphia Police Department because I had the previous years become very much involved in a national model around bringing law enforcement leaders together to talk about how we could do something different with young people. You know, I mean, the reality was there are issues around disparities, particularly kids of color coming to the system. And if policing was not going to change their modeling, then the numbers were never going to change. Nothing would shift. You know, and so if 80% of the kids who come into the criminal justice system came in by police, you know, you can do all the things you want, but the disparities would still be there and the numbers would be there. In 2011, 2012, I went through this transformation of being exposed to adolescent development. Like, what the heck is that? You know, development approach. What are you talking about? Trauma-informed approach. And so I went through all of these, started to get all these trainings and would recognize that at some point my light bulb would go on. By 2014, I am pacing and jumping and saying, what am I going to do differently? And so I would embark on a diversion program that I'll share with you as one of our core restorative models. Not justice-led. It was Kevin Bethel as a deputy commissioner saying, I ain't locking up kids for this anymore. And I didn't ask the justice system any permission to do it because I had the authority not to arrest. And so it would be a police-led initiative, and we'll talk about that. And most recently, I had the honor of coming back to the school district. I started the diversion program in 2014, and then did some work around the nation, traveling all over the country, talking to law enforcement leaders on how we can do things different with our young people, and ultimately landed in 2019 through a relationship with Dr. Height and now with Dr. Wallington to reimagine the work we do in the Office of School Safety and how we can embed more, become, as I put in my title, move from more of enforcement to a restorative approach. So I caution you, I come out the blocks telling you that we still arrest young people. You know, there are some egregious things that happen in our system that unfortunately our kids will go into the DA's office and you know, Ms. Warwick and others will work with those young people, or the system will be dealing with them. But we lean from the space of restorative. And so what I want to share with you, you know, in the next maybe 20 minutes is just kind of what does that look like when you take an agency. I have 400 plus men and women, around 350 of them are school safety officers in our schools. They do not carry guns, they do not carry mace, they do not carry tasers. They have their mouth and a pair of handcuffs. And so what does it look like when you take a department? We don't have police officers, sworn police officers in our schools. What does it look like when you take an agency like that and move them from what was, even though they didn't have that equipment and didn't present themselves as police officers? We were called police officers. So the title you see today is school safety officers. We would change that title. But what does that look like? And so walk with me and we'll see where we go with it. And I think I've really just already emphasized that, you know, I work with Round Revision, our role in support of students in school communities, right? You know, it was about, you know, forcing the safe, and my job is to keep them safe. But, you know, making sure that we were doing our process in a procedurally just way, which was impacting how we dealt with our kids. And I have a slide where I'll kind of talk about how we changed our weapon detection systems in our space. But more importantly, one of my core works, and has been my work since 2000, over the last 8 years, is really dismantling the school to prison pipeline. I work every day to keep kids out from going into the system to the best of my ability. And I'll share how that can work when someone changes policy and implements that. So one of the things when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, so I'll start with, like I said, our core program is Ms. Warwick has our core program. This is my core program. But it's about zero tolerance was what's in the school district at the time, you know, and so, you know, I believe it was 1980, I forget the actual date, but the Safe School Act, where it said there was no guns in school, that would change the dynamics across the nation. And so we would enhance our measures. Now, metal detectors are in all of our schools, but we put metal detectors in our schools because before even the Safe School Act, I mean, because of a shooting of a principal at Bartram High School and subsequently someone at South Philly High. Strong disciplinary process in play. But, you know, when I started in 2014, you know, we were arresting 1,600 kids in school every year. Majority of those kids were kids of color. No questions asked. I can sit here and tell you the day I pulled the data when I have this kind of new knowledge in my mind, and I pulled the data because I wasn't looking at that. I ran and oversaw the schools as someone working for me. And I look at a process and I'm saying, well, what does that look like? And looking down on a piece of paper, and it was a day that I will never, ever forget. When I'm looking down, I'm saying, I'm locking up children for this? For that? Fights in the school? Young girls who come to school with mace, you know, who are protecting themselves. We put them in a cell block and hold them in there for 6 hours and then let them go. Like, I mean, who really? That's who I, as someone born and raised in the city. I didn't show it today, but I do a video where I show a video of a child being arrested and walking through the process of being arrested. When I'm done with that video, I share people like, this is what we would do for a child who came in with a cutting instrument in the school. And at the end, I tell people, well, the video is my daughter. Because I took my daughter out on a Saturday and did a video because I walk into spaces and I tell people, do you know what you're doing when you send them to me? It's easy for you to send them to the system, right? To have me lock up a child. But would you do that if it was your child? I tell people I would have tore down the building had somebody called me and told me to lock up my Dominique Bethel, who was in the video, for coming to school with a cutting for scissors at the time. And she's acting. I mean, if my daughter was here today, only thing she worried about is her underarms being wet. Why can't I get that out the video? But she's a 19-year-old child who's a freshman at Spelman College in Atlanta. She's doing phenomenally well. But I think about all the children that preceding that I had allowed to get arrested in the city of Philadelphia. And now, ladies and gentlemen, there's thousands and thousands of kids that we were arresting before 2014 that I can't go back and apologize to you why I locked you up for a fight. Now, I fought in school. So part of that transformation for me, and you hear the passion in my voice oftentimes, is I believe what I'm doing. No one's making me do what I do. And I wouldn't be in this space if no one didn't allow me to do what I'm doing. And so part of that is, oftentimes I ask people, and people ask me, what would be that transformation for me? And I'll tell you, I don't try to be an expert. I play many roles, but part of one time I was sitting there saying, hey, I'm listening to all this talk about brain science and all of this stuff. And a doctor walked over who was an expert in that space and kept just do that. The wrong question is, what did you do? The right question is, what happened to you? And I think Ms. Warwick talks about, slowing things down. We were locking up kids who come in for a night, but we didn't ask them. They got bullied all week long. And now they were just carrying a knife as a protection. But when they came to the metal detector, we'd tag you're it. And so part of my work was to slow it down. I wanted to do a quick exercise. I didn't do the slide real quick, but I wanted to ask, oftentimes when I'm in this session, and I ask folks, and maybe you can drop it in the chat, and Janine, maybe you can help me, because I don't want to touch my buttons and mess anything up over here since I'm rolling along. But I often tell people, when I walk into a space, I say, knowing what you all know now, what you could have been arrested for. Like, knowing where you're at now as adults, and you think back, I'm locking up children for fights in school. I'm locking up children for coming to school with mace. I'm locking up kids who come in with a Cub Scout knife. I'm BB guns, toy guns. But what are the things, just in the chat, like, folks would get there and get locked. Alcohol, like all those things we did at adolescence, I think sometimes we forget. And so if you're not comfortable, you don't have to do that. But I do put it as a thought for you. Because oftentimes I used to do a training for chiefs of police across the nation, and I would bring them in a room and I do this exercise and I pass out the index cards to them. And they were anonymous, right? They could just write on the cards. And so when I was done, I would read those cards to them. And in fact, those cards would say theft, retail theft, carried a gun, stole something, did this, all of the things. I said, well, look where you're at now. Look around in the room and see where you're at now. You're chiefs of departments across the nation, and look what you did. But we still would lean to arrest, even though we know we did those things. And so it's important as you think through, and I don't know if Jeannie and anybody had any courage to drop it in and spot if they didn't.
Well, yeah, we actually have a gentleman, Eugene, talks about my son could have been locked up for bringing a knife in his lunch to cut up an apple. This happened in elementary school.
Yeah.
Luckily, his teachers and principals understood this was not for violent purposes, but wow, right? It
is. And so part of that, so again, no reason to respond, but just wanted to kind of table that for you when you think about, I often tell people it's okay to do everything we do, but I'll always ask you, what would you do if it was your child? If you can keep that at the backdrop of how you operate in this space, it'll give you balance. Because I think it's easy for Kevin Bethel to lock up anybody in the city of Philadelphia, as long as it wasn't my children. All right, and so as we go through that process, so how will we do it? We part of what I talked about was this, creating this collaboration to really address how we're going to stop arresting kids in our system. And so the collaboration, but I have no qualms of telling you I was in the middle of it. I was not asking anybody's permission. I know I'm not gonna lock up children. I go to the Commissioner Ramsey at the time. I said, boss, I'm not locking up children anymore for this low-level offenses. There's gotta be a better way. He said, what do you wanna do? I wanna do a diversion program. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I would change policy. I didn't need, would not be led by the judiciary. It would not be led by any attorney telling me. It was a reality that we in policing had to do something different. So, but all of these partners, as you see on here, would support me in that work because I couldn't do it alone. I needed the support of other individuals, the DA's office, the family court, and DHS would be one of my biggest partners because DHS would step in and say, hey, we have these community-based programs that you can use to divert your young people. They're the same kids who come from the system or referral, and that would be a game changer for it. Drexel University, they weren't gonna believe me if the numbers go down. But if I had the university evaluating, but I also want the university to evaluate, was what I doing, was it working? Was it making things better? Did I have to change it? And so we would do that. And so here's how our process used to look. When we took non-restorative approach, it was just Kevin Bethel. If you look at the middle, it was an incident happened, school police contacted the PPD and arrest. That was it. That was our whole entire system. We would determine, no, well, for these low-level offenses, we're not going to arrest for anymore. We would identify what those offenses would be. We would create an intake center because I had to make sure that I controlled for the bias. Every student who was eligible, who had met our eligibility, would be diverted. I could care less where they came from. I don't care if they were a good student, their grades were not. I didn't want to hear any of that. Here's the offense, and here's what you could be diverted for. But one of the things I did, I spent a lot of time in narcotics in Philadelphia, and I went through a lot of doors. I tell people I thought I was a poor until I became a cop. And then I went to some doors and I'm like, oh my God, I wasn't as poor as I thought I was. And so part of me was, you got to get to those homes, you got to work with those families, you got to get in there. And DHS would agree to do that and move into that space. And so we would come up with a program where kids would be diverted, that we would come to the school, we would not take them from the school, we would give them a letter, tell their parents that they're going to go into this diversion program. The DHS and social work is going to come out. It's not about going, issues around dependency or violating families, about how do we support them? How do we help them? How do we help the child and other family members all the time in that space? And then they work with those programs anywhere from 3 months. Some kids will stay 6 months because they need the additional support. And that's the diversion process. But what I also realized, and what I think Ms. Warwick mentioned on it, in process, there used to be, there was a consequence if you didn't finish the program. You got to do something. You got to penalize them if they don't. We took the approach that we would not. That the system had always told families, you have to do this. And by this time, ladies and gentlemen, I know the system didn't work. And so I'm sitting there saying, well, no. First and foremost, why am I locking up a child for this anyway? What is the benefit for me putting this child into the system for a child coming to school with mace who was trying to protect herself? And so she didn't finish my program. I'm going to prove to everybody that, hey, she could be penalized by locking her up. No, we would allow the program to work effectively. And guess what? Some kids don't finish my program, and they oftentimes just do as well as the kids who do. Oftentimes it's smack on the hand. Don't do that again. Okay, mom, I won't take that to school anymore. And those children will go on and do very well. Part of the program was really around, providing support to them. So we use intensive preventive services. There are 6 of the community-based programs across the city. And you see just an outline of, I won't read it to you, but the outline of the supports, and it depends on where that child's at and where they're at and the need. And I often challenge folks, well, you do this program. Well, listen, I recognize I can't take many of the kids out of trauma that they live in every day. Some of our kids live in some of the most challenging, violent communities in America. And so, but part of what the goal is to try to give them the skills to how to manage in that space, how to deal with the anger in that space, how to do the things that Ms. Warwick talked about. Instead of retaliating, how do you learn to work through your retaliation? How do you work through it? If a child has never had anybody in their space to give them those skills, then why should we be surprised when the first thing they do is just act out in a violent nature? And so part of that is really working with them. And so what does it look like when you change a policy and go to a more restorative approach where you're looking at kids in a different way? You're not penalizing them, but supporting them and giving them the tools they need to succeed. Well, listen, I'm more than glad to share my stats to show you that what we did from a system that used to do 1,600, I hear, I think it denotes a little over 200. Last year, we had about 165 kids out of a system that used to do 1,600 kids. And many of those kids will still get diverted. And once they get into the system in a post-diversionary model, through the work that Ms. Warwick is doing and others at the DA's office, some will penetrate the system because of just such the egregious nature. But most of the offenses we take in the system now are those high-level aggravated assaults, those types of things that come into our system, and we leave the low-level activity to support that. And just another slide, just to share with you, what does it look like when you say you're not going to lock up kids for coming to school with weapons anymore, unless they have a gun? Well, it pretty much evaporates. What happens when the city would change to a policy of a ticket for marijuana, but we still divert kids for tickets for marijuana. Why? Because we think there is an opportunity to engage those kids. Some of our kids are self-medicating. Listen, I was in narcotics. I saw it as a gateway drug. Well, they smoke weed, then they go to this. I never looked at it as a model where a child would be using that to deal with some of the trauma they're dealing with. The first job I ever diverted, and this was pre-policy trains across the city, was a young girl from Central High School who lost a sibling, parents going through a divorce. She talks to her girlfriends. She doesn't know how to deal with it. And they told her, hey, smoke marijuana to help you. And we not had the diversion program, that child would be arrested. That child graduated from the University of Pittsburgh, doing extremely well because we were able to go in there, provide the support she needed. Even mom needed supports because our program is really built about the family. It's not just about the child. Because, so we have that luxury and ability. It's only kind of, we don't lock up for fights anymore. And so part of that, and then, some of the things that just, I add on there, even assaults on the police officers, I don't let my officers go into the classroom for code of conduct issues. And so we've been really worked intentionally to reduce that. And just a quick slide, we track it, as I share with you. We do a modeling, Dr. Naomi Goldstein, the Drexel's been our researcher since we started. And you can see over the 2 year, the top line really represents those kids who were arrested the year before us. The line below us is the kids who were diverted. So, there's about a 5% difference in those individuals. In our first year, we do extremely well. We do find after our second year, the kids start to kind of look the same. And so we know we have some work to do, but that's why it's important to continue to have a data-informed process so we know where to make those adjustments are. And so as I pivot, I highlight that program, but because that was our marquee program. That was like our first entree, school safety, school police at the time, and now school safety, Philadelphia Police Department. We do this collaboration. It's restorative, it's trauma informed, it's all those things. But then I had the honor and pleasure to come into the school district. And when Dr. Height had brought me on board to say, hey, Kev, can we do some things different here as an entity? And so I would flip us over from an agency that was really law enforcement led to an agency that was really rooted in restorative. That is my bedrock. Now, again, Ms. Warwick, don't hold me to it because I butcher it all of it, right? I throw restorative around like it's water. And so your definitions gave me a better viewpoint. But from my perspective, anything that I could touch a child with in a different way to build a relationship with that child, it was important to me. And so we would start with restorative practices, but we also knew we had to do training, and do the community outreach and be informed by data, but also understanding that most of my staff, 85% of my staff, well, 90% of my staff, 95 come from the city. The majority of my staff are men and women of color. Majority of my staff are women in this who are in this space. And so part of that was also understanding that I had to work with them as well, because they had their own trauma that came into this space and they had their own biases and issues. So we spent a lot of effort in that space working. What I'll share with you is just some of the restorative work we're doing for the purpose of time, is what our framework looks like. I mean, part of what we would do, as I described, was the diversion program. We would work to change our name and change us to an Office of School Safety and change our uniforms, how we present ourselves in that space. We would establish a youth court. That we have a youth court here at 440, so we send young people to work with young people, and they do an exceptional job of working with some of the offenses. You know why? Because they just ask basic questions. Why did you do it? They don't make it complicated. They make it understanding, and they work with that. We do a lot of work around our mentoring program. We spend a large amount of time in our mentoring space, really working with young people. We have about 18 schools that we're mentoring in now to support young people in that space. And this was a program that was initiated by our strategic partnership, and we kind of took over it. Our youth advisory group, I know Ms. Warwick talked about having young people. I am 59 years old, soon to be 60. I do not know what a 17-year-old, even though I have a child, she doesn't talk to me half the time about what's going on. But I knew it was important that if I was going to be in a youth-dominated space, I have 120,000 young people that I'm responsible for protecting, that they sure as heck need to have a voice in that space. And that was a key to us. We do work around our transition team. And so what we've done around our we work with our transition team and our support services. When kids are coming back from placement, we have officers or safety officers who are designated to be mentors. When they come back into a school from placement, we accept them into our school. We acknowledge who they are, and we work with them to try to make sure that space is much more, transition is much smoother. And we think that's an effective way for us to get into that space. And we also spend a lot of time with our young people. We just created 3 PAL centers where my school safety officers in our toughest middle schools, where we put the officers in the school to run a police athletic league. We're attached to this police athletic league, and we're able to expose kids, young people, to many things that they've never been able to expose. There's nothing more exciting last year to go to the basketball game. We're in the cheapest seats you could ever imagine. You couldn't get any higher but reaching up and touch the rafters. But kids who had never been into and seen a basketball game were the most excited kids you ever could imagine. And that kind of work is where you can transform young people and their minds and what they're doing. As I indicated, that's supported by training. So I'm gonna speed up my pace, so I have a few more slides. But yeah, we really train our folks. You know, they need to know what it meant to de-escalate. They need to know what, you know, what this approach would be around being more restorative. And so as you see across the screen, we really spend a lot of time in training our men and women on how to be in this space, how to understand how to work with young people, how does a development approach and a restorative approach into that space. And one of the areas we really became intentional is our positive safety program, where we work with Drexel University to really, again, lean into the science and our approach to young people. So we have a very, very strong relationship with those kids. And just operation, I just made some key notes to just kind of share with you, not really tied to the restorative approach, but just also recognizing, you know, as I share with you, just changing how we describe ourselves, changing our uniforms. You know, if you're going to go into space, people have to see it, right? And so I have a restorative justice specialist who works in my schools to support us as we work, community relations, working with our victims because it's important to us. And more importantly, doing the town halls and working with the community to see if what we're doing is working. Am I meeting what the system asks us to do, or am I sitting in a silo? I briefly described, I mean, we wouldn't call this a restorative approach, but maybe at the beginning, maybe Ms. Warwick, I might at the beginning of it, but you know, we had a process where we would just, kids came through our metal detectors at all of our high schools. I know that's a whole nother conversation for many, but we also recognize that it was not based on our judicial, what would I say, procedurally just. So we changed our signage, how we did it, you know, just circles and signs. Kids don't have to read anything. You can't come here with a gun. You can't come here with these things. We did a lot of training around that, but one of the things we did is in a more effective approach, we had amnesty boxes. So a child who comes into the school who has something they should not have had is able to throw that in the box before they even walk into the system. Got a lot of pushback about that. Well, the kids ain't gonna do it. Ladies and gentlemen, they do it all day long. The kids will drop it. Oh, let me check my pockets. If I count the number of things that they drop in the containers now, I probably have 200 more kids who had to go through the diversion program. Because I don't even need to do net widening. You know, kid makes a mistake, he comes in, I carried that knife over the weekend because I was going from point A to point B. Oh, I still got it in my bag. She can stop at the door. No, it's not in preview of the officers. Drop it into the container and keep moving. And we thought that was a great addition to be able to make it a process that was more effective. And I just really added these slides at the end just to share with you that, you know, as Kevin can't work in a silo, so we are under a review by Education Trust to really evaluating us, comparing us against the rest of the nation. You know, I mean, I've made this edict to my staff that I want to be the best school safety agency in America. That's my goal. That's my vision. I can't do that unless I get tested amongst others, prodded by others from outside to see if the things that I'm implementing, it's a new space for me, is effective. And so we've been looking at Education Trust has been really supporting us in this space, and evaluating us as on the ground, talking to folks to see if we're doing an effective job. And so I will stop there. And just really thank you for the opportunity, Janine and Ms. Warwick, for allowing me to be co in this with you, this presentation. And I know we're going to open it up for questions. Thank you so much.